G'day, welcome back. This is the next video in my series on edge cases, which where I take a drawing zone or transition zone, which is in a common chess position, normally endgame, and try and explain why those zones exist. Now, so far we've looked at some of the more common ones or well-known ones, Vancouver position, and for instance, the queen versus a single pawn in the endgame, and what zone the stronger side's king has to be in to force the win. And today I'm moving on to this position, which is from Cheron. It's kind of typically called the number one position. And you can see that there's those two odd squares. In this position, it's e5 and e6. Why does the black king has to be on those two squares to enable the game to be drawn? You can ignore all the other sort of green squares there. That's basically where the king is in front of the pawn. Now, the point about this is this Cheron position, he's quite famous for this particular position where the defending king is cut off from the pawn, but the defending side's rook can defend by using frontal attack. So that's what we're going to look at today. We're going to try and understand why e5 and e6 are the two drawing squares. Now, this gives us an opportunity, as I've been trying to do, is introduce a few of these composers as we go along. So just have a quick look here, switch over to Wikipedia. So the guy we're talking about here today is Andrei Cheron, famous for these rook positions, as I've talked about. But you can see he's actually a very, very famous guy. He's actually got his own Wikipedia page, although it's quite short, known as a chess player, endgame theorist, and composer of endgame studies. So you can read about him there a little bit. And anyway, you can see he was born in 1895 and died in 1980, so he lived to a ripe old age. And also, just to see how he fits in terms of the chronology, let me just switch across to my very, very boring Excel chart. I've plonked him in here. So we've looked at Lecoq and Bianchetti and Reti. They were quite early on, right? And Cheron, Grigoriev, born about the same time, but you can see that Grigoriev died quite young and a little bit earlier than Bar. His contribution to chess theory. Okay, so what I want to do quickly now, look, the name is Practical Bending, and this is his piece about Cheron position, attributed to 1923, so that's quite early on. And then you just can see the defender's king is cut off from the passed pawn. However, thanks to the favorable position of his rook, black can prevent the advance of the pawn. With accurate play, can save the game. And you can see here that the correct play is when white plays rook d4 in that position, then the black king goes to e5 to attack the rook, and that restricts what white can do. So you can see that's giving us a bit of a clue in terms of why e5 and e6 might be the key squares. So we'll go through lines like that as we analyze this position in a little bit more detail. But as you can see, it's quite a famous position. And then the other side, which I haven't covered, there's another Grigoriev position in rook endgames. We've mainly looked at his positions in pawn endgames, but here he's done a rook endgame. Okay, cool. I might look at that in a future video, but for now we're going to look at that Cheron 1923 position. Okay, here we are back on my little simulation, which we've seen before. You can see that those boxes, so this will be black to move, white to win. So let's change this to white to move. And now you start to see the situation. So white to move, it's a win for white. You can see that the squares which the black king has to be on. Let's change that to working out if it's a draw for black. And that gets back to the diagram I started off with, right? That black draws if his king is on any of those positions, even if it's white to move. And you can see this is the whole question. What about e5 and e6? I think those other three rows of squares, 5 corner, just probably use Philidors. And you can see we just move the white king around, doesn't make much difference. Well, if the white king's there already, it's too late. King has to be in front of the pawn already. And if we move the white king further back, it gives black further scope. So we're just trying to work out why those two squares are there. And we'll just have a look at it. Just change the result to a win for white. And this is kind of what we're going to basically look at. Remember those red squares is where black would have to do something. Now, we'll have a look at the lines, but for instance, if he's on E7 or F7 or F6 or F5 or F4 or E4, we'll work out that actually his drawing line is to pop into those squares E5 and E6, and it can hold the position. And we have a look at the reverse of that. Black would have to be on those squares. So let's go back to this one. I'll do a calculation. And in fact, that will generate the file with all the, we've seen this before, all the different drawing lines. And what we're going to do now is we're going to go across to Skid versus PC and run through those lines and understand exactly why black's king needs to be on 5 and 6. Just 1 second while I do that. Okay, here we are. So if you remember, the way we do this is I put the same set of positions in with a different location of the black king, the defending side's king in this case, and then we say with white to move, how does white win? And then we say with black to move, how does black draw? So first of all, we'll just go through the white winning strategies in each of these positions. You can just quickly see there's 8 king locations for the black king. King A4, you can see E4, F4, F5, F6, E7, F7, E8, which are all those squares we look at on the simulation. Okay, now, so with the black king cut off on the other side on A4, let's have a look. In fact, it doesn't actually give me a line because it's basically just rook to A1, checkmate. So we need to say anything more of that one. Let's go into these more interesting positions. So we're on E4, we're not on E5. Okay, so what's the winning line? Okay, it's rook to D5. And what white has done then is it's cut the black king off on the 5th rank, can't get back. You can see the difference between if it was on one of the squares we were talking about. It was on E5 or E6 and be cut off. Anyway, so we're cut off. So let's continue with the line. Maybe black goes rook A8, not much else to do. Get the rook out of the way with the black king cut off. Check. You can see, well, this is a crazy line, but anyway, I mean, obviously the black king is way white could defocus and the black king off by many rows by switching back. So position so lost that basically the computer doesn't give a proper defense. And if we didn't go that way, here B4 is the winning line, swings across to, the rook stays in A1. Let's see what happens if we stay there. Just going to push it. Just going to cut off. So that's one thing that can't afford to have the black cut off behind the white pawn. Large forwards. Okay, so let's move to the next position, which is the king on the F4 square. It's going to be the same problem, just get cut off. So as I say, we're going through each of these lines and seeing what happens to black, what going through each of these lines and seeing how white wins the position. Okay, let's have the next position. Okay, the king, this doesn't look quite as bad. So what's the line here? It's actually more than one. You're given rook d6 as one way of winning. Let's see how that works. Maybe the king now comes back to e5. It's too late. Hold station, for instance. We advance our king. Okay, that black attacks. Now we just get the black king away. Play c5. See, we just. So actually, rook d6 is a sufficient way of winning in that position. But if we go back to the very original situation, there's actually a few winning lines. Even king b4 works in this case. I think it's worth looking at because this might be just seeing what's the difference. This checking strategy is one which often gets used, and then going back and pinning on the C file, but it will check again. Check 5. Back and get onto the pawn. So now the problem is that normal thing, king was there, he would be able to attack the pawn and win it, but the king is too far away. So the king back, too late. The pawn just advancing. That king does attack, for instance. White can hold it. Right, so you can see the difference there. Being on the F file is too far away. Next position. So this is going to be the same technique. You can visualize the same thing happening. Okay, this is a little bit different because rook d6 check would not work because king e7 would attack the rook, so we can't do it that way. So let's just see what happens if we do the trying to advance while checking. 5, rook a check, 6, and then once again, the problem is that black king cannot put pressure on the rook too far away. We're getting a very clear perspective of what happens if the black king is way out here. Not going to be able to put pressure on the c pawn quickly enough. Another position. Okay, so this is more interesting because now we're on e7. See what the winning line here is. Actually given king b4, check, king a5, rook c8, back to pressuring the pawn. That's often the strategy, the correct strategy in these cases. Okay, so there is several winning lines here. Let's just go with what the computer has given me, and actually it demonstrates the point more clearly. So by moving the rook up to d4, it's not going to be attacked by the black king. So the rook on d4 can hold it. The line continues. Maybe king e6 is the most logical move. Then we just king. Now try and attack the rook. Seems better to swing over. If there's a couple of lines here, if we check, then white's just advancing. The pawn's held. It's going to. Okay, so that's one way of thinking about it. It doesn't really have many places to go because we're just going to push the pawn, right? So you can see that not being able to attack the white rook on the d4 square quickly enough was the downfall in that position. f7. And let's try e8. There's another possible square. Once again, we just can say we check. Checks. And now we just advance the pawn. So you can see what's happened in most of those cases is that because the white rook is able to take up these squares while not being attacked by the black king, that gave white that extra tempo to be able to get his king around and advance there's no defense. So, okay, so that was those positions with white to move. White won the positions. Right, now let's go to the other file. Same positions. How does black draw? Okay, let's have a look. This is an odd position. There's not really one of the ones we're looking at, but the drawing line is as follows. King a5. We're getting the king back. Let's try and do something like cut the king off. There's a few drawing lines that just get the rook out of the way. Let's say white advances, tries back to the back. There's anything else? Just say c5. Check. King goes forwards. And it kind of looks okay. Check. King moves up there. Hold station. Okay, we shield. Check. Shielding doesn't help, so let's say we the king, and then we pop across. Check. 6. And we can see the point here is this is just the look at the checking distance. This is just going to be checks from the long side. Okay, that's not really a position I would look at, but it kind of gave you an interesting solution. Okay, so now we start looking at these squares. What does black have to do in this position where his king is on e4? Well, the drawing line is simply king e5. Now back on e5, and now you get this position. If white tries to advance, we just check. Just check. Right, so okay, but the black can only go to b5. Let's try checking here. Black runs up there, then we just go back and we pressure the pawn. Thing is that black king is holding that square, so the white will not take the d4 square and protect the pawn, and the pawn is going to be lost, or we just repeat moves. King would come back and check, and there's no progress. Okay, that's good. So now we're starting to understand why e5 square is so important. Okay, it'd be the same thing here. King e5 will hold the draw. Now this one's interesting because it's giving me two lines. King e5 and king e6 both hold the draw. So let's look at king e6. King e6 is the other alternative. Okay, what's so good about king e6? Okay, so let's do the same thing. Winning approach would be, we think, bring king along. Check. King up. Check. Check. There, for instance, repressure at the end of that. So let's see what the problem with rook d4. Okay, it's the same thing. It's king if the check, go back, and now we've got the same position. Back, but let's check. The a file is just going to be checked again. Sneaky and slip through here, there, there. Otherwise, not making progress. Get the rook somewhere. Pushing the pawn. See what pawn. You lose. Oh, rook's going to drop. So white's just bound up. Can't do anything. So you can see that the point is, if we go all the way back to where we were originally, rook d4 in this position, still it's king e5 now. King e6 has this way. If you tried rook d5, check there. Try another one. Move the rook away. Pawn drops. Move the rook sideways. And even just cut off the white king. Pawn advances. King. White pawn advances, which come back. 5. That was f6 square. Now we get f7. Actually, there's a couple of drawing methods here, by the way. Rook d8 does it, right? If rooks are off, then we'll get a standard position where black is opposition in front of white pawn, almost like the Greg Fischer game we've seen on a couple of occasions. And if the white rook backs off, then a king pawn. Okay, so I think what we've seen there, just in conclusion, is that the key to these two squares is that basically either in one move or straight away it puts pressure on the d4 square where the white rook may need to be to hold them. That's why these two squares are quite interesting in terms of giving you a little drawing zone. You're either there or you're not there. And if you're not there, well, if you're in this whole area over here, you're usually fine because you're in front of the pawn. End up with setting up a type of position, right? But if you're not there, you can still draw if your king is cut off by the one rank, but only if you're on 5, 6 squares. Okay, that's quite interesting. So I hope you've found a little bit of insight into why this Cheron's position number 1 has that little drawing zone. Okay, so I've just added this game coverage for the Cheron position number 1, which everybody includes. It's Kochyev versus Smyslov from a 1978 zonal tournament, which Smyslov didn't even qualify from. I don't know what happened to him that year. Just very quickly, I mean, I've had a bit of issues with the recording this time, so it's a bit more choppy and changing. Anyway, I wanted to include this game, as other people do, because it shows that actually even the best players can go wrong. So you can see this position. It's just a fairly typical position in the rook endgame. White has his king cut off, So that sort of gives you the framework for it. Looks pretty much like a Cheron position. And you just see, so gradually what we have here is, at this stage, Smyslov's doing fine. His king is on the right spot, and he attacked the rook, and then now he's moved his rook across to spot the pawn, so that has to be defended. And you have this position here. Pawn can't be pushed because the rook would fall. King can't move because the pawn would fall. So this is just basically been playing around. Rook goes back, check, pushes the king back. It looks like at this stage black is making no whatsoever. Playing around, rook d7, and this is where the problem is. Look at the eval bar on this, right? It's even. Remember we were saying, well, just to be staying in those two squares, and if the king comes out, we check it. But unfortunately, Smyslov, he went to king to e2, and actually his opponent, also a very strong GM, knew exactly what to do. Okay, now we march the king out. Check. Go back. The problem is, oh dear, because white king can have two squares to attack the rook. And now that the pawn is held, we can advance our king. This is the sort of formation, right? Rook gets pushed away, white king back, pawn will advance. So that's a very interesting real world example of you need to know this rule or you can get. Okay, great. Thank you very much for watching.